Hello, my name is Matthew Strader, and in this video, I will be presenting on how advanced defensive metrics are used in the NBA. I'll also be discussing which one is the most effective and the downfalls of each one. The first one I'd like to discuss is basically the defensive metric that started it all. This, of course, would be defensive plus minus, and I've also included defensive win shares on this bubble. The first one, being defensive plus minus, is strictly based on the box score, hence why it comes from BPM, or box plus minus, and is calculated by using this equation that I've clipped into the top of the frame. It is basically just box score rates such as steal percentage, block percentage, assist percentage, turnovers, all that stuff, multiplied by different coefficients, and then all added together. And then based on that number, we're able to calculate defensive plus minus. The downfall of this is that it doesn't account for a lot of situations. For example, when there's really good defense, but the offense is just better, or late in the shot clock, the defense has made the offense work for 20 seconds, but since the players are so talented in the NBA, they're able to make really, really difficult shots. And that makes it hard. Because in that situation, whether it was an open layup because the guy that was defending him was literally sitting on the bench, or he was right in his face, contesting the jump shot, doesn't make a difference in the defensive plus minus. In defensive plus minus, they are both the same. And the same can kind of be said for defensive win shares. It's calculated using defensive rating and league averages for points per game and pace and stuff like that. And the general point that I'd like to make for both of these stats is that they're both top-down metrics, meaning that the individual's score is really biased towards players that are on better teams. Or in other words, the individual's performance is really derived from the performance of the unit, like the five-man lineup. Additionally, blocks and steals, box score metrics, are incomplete, just as a matter of fact. Steals are usually a risky play for a defender to go for because it usually ends up in an open jump shot if they don't get it. And blocks are typically a last-ditch effort to stop a guy that's already either decided they want to go for a shot, or they're already at the rim and you're just contesting a layup. Not to mention, a lot of blocks and steals end up personal fouls as well. So that basically rounds up defensive plus minus and win shares. Both of these are box score based metrics. They're useful, and they've been proven to have value, of course. However, especially on the defensive side of things, just looking at box score metrics can be really limiting in how we evaluate the defensive side of a player's game. So that leads me into my next metric, which I found interesting and I've seen used pretty frequently. And this is 538's Draymond metric. Draymond stands for defensive rating accounting for yielding minimal openness by nearest defender. It's kind of silly. Draymond is obviously a tip of the hat to Draymond Green because he's known league-wide as being a great defender, but it's basically calculated on the opponent's shooting percentage in different areas of the court. And the theory behind this is kind of encapsulated in this quote that I've included at the bottom of this bubble. It says, "The main goal of shooting defense, especially in today's spacing-centric ball movement forward offensive era, is really just to minimize the chance of an open shot." So, when most offenses are now geared towards just taking the first open shot they can find, or getting a double team to commit to stopping a player getting into the paint so you can get an open three, what really qualifies as good defense is just limiting the chances that the offense gets open shots. And that's what the Draymond metric tries to isolate. So the strengths of this metric is that it measures shot contention and repression. By doing this, it does this by looking at player tracking data that's only been made available in the last few years. But a weakness is that it still only looks at one shooter and one defender's particular, percentages. So it doesn't really take into account the spacing on the particular floor, the particular spacing on the floor, or whether or not it was late in the shot clock. And another thing that Draymond metric does not do is take into account possessions that end in a personal foul. 538's Draymond metric was really a step in the right direction as far as, if BPM and win shares and box score metrics in general are over on this side of the spectrum, Draymond measures defensive impact on this side of the spectrum, where this is looking at steals and countable things and like changes of possession. Draymond is really looking at repression and contention of shots. That doesn't show up in the box score, but obviously it's better defense than just having them have a wide open shot. And that leads us into the next point, which, in my opinion, well, based on my research so far, just on the internet and what you can find, seems to be the best, most cutting edge defensive metric that we have. And it's called counterpoints, and it was presented on at Sloan Conference. Looks like a couple years ago, but it's similar to Draymond that it uses the on-court tracking data to measure which players are guarding which, and it's looking at all 5 matchups. And something that's different between counterpoints and Draymond, instead of just looking at the end of the possession the way that Draymond does when it only looks at the shot, counterpoints is always tracking all 5 players, and when a shot is scored, those 2 points are then, like, the responsibility for those points is then distributed based on distance from the player to all 5 defenders on the court. It also takes into account who that person is guarding. So one could easily infer that guarding Rajon Rondo is not the same as guarding Steph Curry all game. And one thing that counterpoints, or these men that were doing this research, were able to set up is these matchup-based box scores, which are particularly useful for figuring out, say, if James Harden was able to just torch your team all night and go for 50-plus points. You're able to look at the breakdown of who was responsible for most of James Harden's points, and then using that piece of data, look back at film and figure out what went wrong and what adjustments you can make for the next time you face him. And then the most important and honestly really cool development that these guys showed in their presentation was the development of these defensive shot charts. And these things are really cool. I wish I had an example to pull up on the screen. Basically, it takes how frequently shots are taken against this player, because if you're able to minimize the amount of shots a player takes, you're a good defender. But it also shows how well you are contesting those shots and making them harder than a typical shot from that distance. So in the video, the team of analysts that were working on counterpoints used the 2014-2015 Pacers as an example. And when you look at all 5 of their starting, or the 5 players that played the majority of their minutes, George Hill, Stevenson, Paul George, Hibbert, and West, and you look at all 5 of these defensive shot charts, you're really able to put into perspective what their defensive scheme and how just strong they were defensively. All of the perimeter players, the 3 perimeter players, were able to limit 3-pointers, and when they were 3-pointers, they were able to keep them at a below league average rate. And that would then force teams to take the majority of their shots around the rim, which Roy Hibbert led the league in shot contention and kept everybody shooting at league lows around the rim. One might be able to think that this would imply that teams were attacking Roy Hibbert because he was the weak link on the defense, but it's probably more likely that the Pacers were funneling all of the perimeter offensive players into Roy Hibbert because he was such a defensive backbone for them. So now that we've had a look at multiple different defensive metrics, I think it's just important to kind of talk about, some inconsistencies between all of these different metrics. For example, there's a classic debate whether or not Russell Westbrook or Klay Thompson is a better defender, and both are very athletic, very gifted, and have the potential to be great defenders on any given possession. But based on box score metrics, Russell Westbrook is far and away better than Klay Thompson, based on just his rebounding numbers, steals, block. Whereas Klay Thompson, if you look at the Draymond metrics, he does a great job of limiting the opposing team's best player and holding and contesting all of his shots. But because of that, because he's always contesting shots, he doesn't get nearly as many rebounds. And since he's always staying disciplined and staying in front of the opposing team's best player, he doesn't get steals or blocks nearly as often. So, box score metrics favor Russell Westbrook, and Draymond and other metrics prefer Klay Thompson. And this doesn't mean that you necessarily have to choose one or the other. It's more of just understanding that there's a difference between the two. So, Trevor Ariza might be a good he's a decent defender, but he goes for a lot of steals, and his tendency is to go for steals. He has a high steal percentage compared to other players. However, this often leads to open shots, which count against him in the Draymond category. So when you take both of these things into context, it's just important to understand that you take the good with the bad, and typically these defensive metrics complement each other in different ways. Another thing that I think is important to highlight is how in the Counterpoints presentation they had a question and answer session afterwards, and something that they're working on integrating is more of the intricacies of the basketball game into their metric. This kind of idea is summed up by a quote that I have from Coach Scott Schmelzer, who's an assistant coach for the women's basketball team for Florida University. He said that the shortfall of each defensive metric is that they're primarily estimates. They don't take into account great defense that still results in a score. In these situations, you really have to truly rely on your eye, which I'd imagine is the case for all analytics, but especially defensive. And that's what makes evaluating an individual's defense so difficult. Like we said back in the defensive plus minus and win shares bubble, individual defense really is a top-down metric and is really a product of the unit more than the individual. So it's hard to isolate single players. And then Draymond is like a completely different way of looking at measuring defense. And now we have these kind of conflicting ideologies between box score metrics and we'll call them Draymond metrics. And then Counterpoints seems to be the most comprehensive and complete way of looking at a 5-man defensive lineup, because you can look at all 5 of their defensive shot charts and you can see where particular defenders affect all 4 other defenders on the floor with how they defend certain shots. So I know that's a lot to take in, and just I'd like to say in conclusion, analyzing a particular player's defense is an incredibly tall task, and it requires you to look at the problem from multiple different angles. In this case, I think it is important to take into account both box score metrics as well as player tracking data, and I believe that the Counterpoints model that was developed by the team that presented at Sloan is the most comprehensive way of doing this. But that isn't to say that there isn't downfalls to that too. We need to find ways to improve this model by somehow incorporating personal fouls, after timeout plays, momentum in a game could even be a factor. I mean, there are multiple things that go into any given moment of defense. So I guess that's where I'll end it. That's all I have. This problem is very expansive, and I mean, people, write their PhD theses on it, and it's super interesting. I learned a lot doing this little research project, and I hope you enjoyed watching.